So it's my great pleasure to introduce David Huron. He's Arts and Humanities Distinguished Professor Emeritus at The Ohio State University in the School of Music and at the Center for Cognitive and Brain Sciences. So he's originally Canadian, or is Canadian, I don't know, was born in Northern Alberta, grew up in Ottawa, where he received extensive musical training. He did his undergraduate studies at the University of Waterloo, a master's degree at York University, and a PhD in musicology at the University of Nottingham. His laboratory produced over 200 publications during his tenure, mostly on computational musicology, music cognition, music and emotion. And I think David prides himself in having trained many scholars in the field of music cognition. Among his many distinctions, he's received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Society for Music Perception and Cognition and the Society for Music Theory. Last year, he was a recipient of the Nico Frieda Honorary Chair in Cognitive Science at the University of Amsterdam Brain and Cognition Center. And I should say that David was awarded a CRBLM Fulbright Research Chair, but unfortunately, owing to COVID, he was unable to take up his term here. David would very much like to still have that opportunity to interact with our members, and we hope that this talk will open up opportunities for more interaction in the future. And so if people would like to stay behind at the end after questions are over, we'll keep the line open in case anybody wants to sort of start developing conversation. So we hope this won't be the only opportunity for interaction with David. And I also want to mention that I think that he's the author of 3 books, and one is about to come out. Maybe we'll hear more about it in the talk today. So welcome, and we look forward to hearing your talk.
Right.
Over to you.
Thank you very much, Denise. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, you can. Okay, good. Yes. Well, first, let me say that I regret that I'm not in Montreal to be able to deliver this presentation in person and meet with folks as the original plan. I'm an empirical musicologist, and much of my research is focused on music and emotion. And one of the main problems in music emotion research is how sounds can induce or evoke emotions in listeners. Much of my recent research in this regard has been trying to understand the experience of nominally sad music. So just what emotions are being induced in listeners when listening to sad music, and how is it possible for that experience to be enjoyable? Well, you can't have a good theory of sad music without having a reasonably good theory of sadness in general. And over the years, I've spent a lot of time with the existing emotion literature and was disappointed to learn that there really isn't a very good theory of sadness. So I ended up assembling my own theory, which is now in the process of being published. The book is entitled The Science of Sadness. It's really a prelude to the book that I'm currently working on, which directly engages the science of sad music. In the process of trying to understand how emotions are induced in listeners and observers, I ended up creating my own theory, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm not going to talk about music, and I'm not going to talk about sadness. Instead, my goal here is to present what I call the signaling theory of emotion-associated displays, or STED. And the intention here is to try to get at how it is that emotions get induced in observers or listeners. This is described in detail in the book that's soon to appear, and I should note that there's a lot to say about the role of culture in emotional displays and interpretations. There are no less than 4 chapters in the book that engage the anthropological literature and look at the important sociocultural aspects of emotion. However, in this presentation, I'm going to focus exclusively on the psychological and behavioral aspects. There simply isn't enough time to delve into any of the cultural topics. So to give you a little bit of a preview here, I'm going to talk about 5 classic problems in emotion research, ethological basics, especially related to signaling theory, a couple of comments about emotion in general, then we'll talk about weeping, talk about smiling, there'll be a conclusion, and then a reprise of the theory. So some classic problems in emotion-related research. Why are emotion-related displays associated with so many possible motivating emotions? So displays like weeping, smiling, and laughter are induced by many more emotions than simply grief, joy, or amusement. So for example, when we look at weeping, we get tears of grief, tears of pain, but we also see tears of joy, humor, pride, patriotism, piety, adoration, and aesthetic beauty. Similarly, with regard to smiling, we have joyful or happy smiling, but also the research literature very much chronicles smiling that's related to various forms of stress, embarrassment, smiling that's simply polite or shy, and socially apprehensive smiling. So the first problem here is the problem of what we might call polygenic displays. That is, many ways, many emotions that end up generating the same display. The second problem here is why should we apparently communicate fear or grief or joy, but not communicate feelings like loneliness, hunger, or affection? Most emotions have no associated displays. So if you think of envy, regret, pride, loneliness, jealousy, nostalgia, suspicion, affection, boredom, compassion, so on, the vast majority of emotions, in fact, have no display associated with them. So the second problem here is the problem of covert emotions. Why are there so many emotions in which there's no associated display? Related problem is if the purpose of an emotional expression is to communicate, why do emotional displays like crying, smiling, or laughing often happen alone in the complete absence of an observer? We might call this the problem of the absent audience. Famously, Paul Ekman conducted cross-cultural research that broadly suggests that various displays are universally recognized. Unfortunately, the pertinent research is marred by methodological issues and small effect sizes. In particular, two meta-analyses that have looked at this in detail really suggest that there's very serious problems in trying to recognize emotional displays cross-culturally and even within a single culture. Moreover, older people are significantly worse than younger people in identifying emotions coinciding with different facial or acoustical displays. So here you see, for example, these are 8 different affects that are being induced or potentially are recognized from sounds, from vocal sounds. And these are percentages. So you can see that in the case of achievement, for example, the young participants, young adults, we're getting about 51% recognition. But you see in the case of older people, these are people in their 60s who are not suffering from any cognitive or perceptual deficits that have been measured. They're very much poor at ostensibly recognizing these different affective states. So if emotions are supposedly universal, why are observers so bad at identifying the underlying emotion corresponding to a given emotional display? So we might refer to this then as the problem of poor display recognition. And finally, why are the apparently both voluntary and involuntary versions of most emotion-associated displays? So famously, perhaps the most famous example is the difference between the genuine or Duchenne smile from the social smile that you see, for example, when you are in an aircraft and the flight attendant comes up and gives you that very simple social smile, please, would you take your seat, and so on. So this is the problem of what we might call willful displays. Okay, let's move on and talk about some ethological basics. Ethology is the study of animal behavior, and among the chief accomplishments in the field are well-developed theories of animal communication. Famously, Konrad Lorenz made an important distinction between signals and cues. This is based on the work of Charles Peirce, the famous semiotician who made these distinctions generally. So what's an example? A signal is a purposeful communicative act involving innate behavioral and physiological mechanisms that change the behavior of the observer. And an example here would be a rattlesnake's rattle. So a rattlesnake doesn't shake its rattle when it's hunting the small mice and so on that form the bulk of its diet. But if you were to encounter it, or a cow where you don't encounter it and so on, it's basically a sort of signal of mutually assured destruction. It sort of says, well, you could harm me, but I could also harm you. It changes the behavior of the observer, in this case, makes us pull back and not want to be anywhere near the snake. And it serves the purpose of the rattlesnake too, in not being inadvertently harmed. A cue, by contrast, is a non-purposeful behavior that nevertheless conveys information. An example might be the buzzing sound made by a mosquito. So we've all learned from experience, you're lying in bed, you've turned out the light, and then you hear that bzzz sound. And from past experience, you know that that presages the possibility of an attack. Now, in both the case of the rattlesnake's rattle and the buzzing sound of the mosquito, there's the possibility of being attacked. But in one case, it's a purposeful communicative act, and the other, it's an artifact. The buzzing sound of the mosquito is an artifact of just simply the need of the mosquito to flap its wings. It's not meant to be communicative. So signals are biologically innate. There is an innate disposition to behave in a particular way, and there's an innate disposition to respond in a particular way when observing the signaling behavior. So how do ethologists determine whether a particular behavior is a signal or a cue? So there are many factors involved. We might just look at 4 of them. First of all, signals tend to be conspicuous. If the purpose of the signal is to change the behavior of the observer, then you need to make sure that you've communicated the signal. So conspicuousness, included as part of conspicuousness, is that signals tend to be multimodal. So we can look at this bear's facial expression, and there's clearly a visual component to it, but we also know that there's a sound that would accompany that particular facial display. And so there's multimodality aspect to it. Signals tend to involve unique behavior and result in a change of behavior in the observer. So there's a place near where I live, a park, where people are allowed to run their dogs off the leash. And I remember being in the park one day, and there was this little white toy poodle that was meandering around. And then diagonally across the park on the other side, there was someone who had a Great Dane that they just let off the leash. And I remember this very vividly. No sooner was that dog off the leash, excuse me, than that Great Dane just made a beeline straight towards this little toy poodle. And the Great Dane was making these vicious sounds as it was charging towards this little dog. And I think everybody in the park was just sort of mortified by the thought that this big dog was going to tear this tiny little dog to pieces. But when the Great Dane got within a meter or 2 of the little toy poodle just rolled over on its back, and that was it. It was all over. The Great Dane just stopped dead, and it was now walking around as though nothing at all had happened. Of course, what had happened was that the little toy poodle had made a signal of submission, basically said, "You're top dog, I'm just the little toy poodle," and that was the end of it. So the signal transformed the behavior of the observer in this case. Now, we can illustrate, and also notice that the signal was mutually beneficial, that it benefited both the toy poodle and the Great Dane. The benefit to the toy poodle was that it didn't get destroyed. And the benefit to the Great Dane was that it established its social dominance as being top dog without any altercation being necessary. So this is another characteristic of signals, is they tend to change the behavior of the observer to the benefit of both the signaler and the behavior and the observer. We can illustrate this mutual benefit of signals by considering another example, the behavior known as stotting. Stotting is observed in ungulates, including several species of deer, gazelles, springboks, and impalas, and you can also observe it in young sheep and goats. Stotting features repeated leaping as high as possible into the air with the legs held stiffly. The behavior typically lasts for less than a minute, and several animals within a herd may engage in stotting about the same time. Stotting is performed only when the animal detects the presence of a predator. When selecting possible prey, predators typically are focusing on weak, injured, or ill animals. So stotting effectively demonstrates the health and vigor of the animal, and cheetahs and African wild dogs have an instinctive disposition to ignore stotting animals as potential prey targets. Okay, so notice that once again, the signal benefits both the predator and the prey. The predator benefits by recognizing that pursuing the stotting animal is likely to be futile. At the same time, the stotting animal benefits by avoiding a prolonged chase and allows the animal to return to vigilant grazing. Incidentally, it's the mutual benefit for both the signaler and the observer that provides the selection pressure, allowing the stotting signal to evolve. Okay, so so signals tend to involve a unique behavioral anatomy. This is another component to it. In the case of the rattlesnake, there's a unique anatomical device, the rattle, which has evolved for this specific purpose. Okay, so summarizing, signals tend to be conspicuous, often involving more than one sensory modality. Signals tend to involve unique behaviors or anatomy. Signals tend to induce a biologically prepared response in observers, and the induced behavior of the observer is typically beneficial to both the signaler and the observer. And note that the mutual benefit provides the selection pressure that allows signals to evolve. Okay, just a couple of comments here then about emotion. So Nico Freide famously characterized emotions as action tendencies. In the presence of an emotion, we're more likely to behave in a particular way. So if a person who's feeling anger is more likely to strike out, for example. Emotions, this is Sylvan Tompkins, characterize them as motivational amplifiers. They encourage us to behave in particular ways. Now, we can distinguish two types of motivations. This is what biologists do. For example, if we talk about food consumption, we can talk about the ultimate biological motivation or purpose, and that's to provide metabolic energy. But that's not what motivates the animal to actually engage in eating behaviors. It's the proximal motivations. It's the feelings of hunger and the pleasure of eating that actually encourage the activity or the behavior that's going to lead to the fulfillment of the ultimate motivation. So emotions then are proximal motivators. We eat because we experience hunger. We build friendships because social bonding is enjoyable and reassuring, although those are not the ultimate biological reasons for doing that. We live our subjective phenomenal lives exclusively in the world of proximal motivations. So we don't necessarily understand the reason why we're behaving, the ultimate purpose of the behavior. We deal with the emotional motivators instead. Since emotions predict subsequent behavior, it's valuable to be able to infer the emotional states of others. So knowing that you're angry helps me to sidestep dangers, or there are other situations where knowing your emotional state, I can take advantage of opportunities that arise because you're in a certain emotional state. Well, there's the flip side to this. Conversely, if someone is able to anticipate our future behavior, our behavior may be rendered ineffective. So it's often not a good idea for people to correctly recognize your emotional state. And in fact, most emotions are not associated with any display behaviors like hunger, envy, regret, pride, loneliness, and so on. A classic illustration of the cost of information is evident in the game of poker. If you're dealt an exceptionally good hand, a happy facial expression is not to your advantage. And over the centuries, players have learned that the best facial expression for playing poker is to have a blank expression that endeavors to communicate nothing. That is the proverbial poker face. From an ethological perspective, it makes no sense to wear our emotions on our sleeves. There are good evolutionary reasons for us not to reveal our inner states to other people because it puts us at a disadvantage. In the business world, it's understood, don't give away information unless it's to your advantage. Although the information may seem innocent, you never know how your competitors might be able to make effective use of it against you. When you think about it, the only reason why one should communicate anything is that it is likely to change the behaviors of those around you to your benefit. As Dawkins and Krebs convincingly argued, the purpose of any display behavior must be to manipulate the behavior of the observer, not to provide information to the observer. That is, the purpose of any display is manipulation, not revelation. Now, you can't simply expect others to change their behavior if it's to their detriment, as in a zero-sum game. The act of communication is going to be most effective when there is some value for the other person as well. That is, the most effective communicative displays are those that produce benefits for both the displayer and the observer. And that's exactly the function of an ethological signal. So, indeed, recall that most emotions have no unique display associated with them. And signaling theory predicts that most emotions should be covert or hidden. So what I propose is that in accordance with signaling theory, the facial displays commonly regarded as basic emotions are not emotions at all. They're signals. Now, wouldn't it be nice if you could change someone else's behavior for your benefit? Since emotions are the most powerful behavioral motivators, the best way to change someone's behavior is to induce a particular emotion in them that motivates them to behave in the desired way. Of course, an observer should resist letting you induce such an emotion unless the ensuing behavior also benefits them. So let's consider an example. Weeping. So here's a firsthand account from Jeffrey Kotler's work. He's done wonderful work on weeping and sadness. This is a firsthand account of something he witnessed. A male physician had been verbally abusing a female hospital administrator. The more she apologized, the more he berated her. It was clear he was not accepting her apology. All of a sudden, a tear welled up in her eye, just a single tear, and ran down her cheek. He stopped cold. This guy, big-time surgeon and all, used to having his way and blustering onward, just stopped dead. This tiny spot of wetness communicated to him very clearly what he had otherwise not seen. He started backpedaling so fast, apologizing like crazy. That single tear had a meaning for him, a way that nothing else did. So the effect of weeping is that it tends to induce prosocial feelings that commonly lead to the offering of assistance or the termination of aggression. So is weeping an ethological signal or a cue? This is the question that any ethologist would ask. So we could ask, is the behavior distinctive? And the answer is yes. Weeping is conspicuous and multimodal, with both distinctive facial displays and distinctive sounds. Does weeping involve any purpose-specific anatomy or physiology? Well, here we could talk a little bit about tears. Ophthalmologists distinguish three types of tears. Basal tears, these are constantly being secreted and just simply lubricate the eyeball. Reflex tears, these are the irritant tears that happen when you chop an onion, for example. And psychic tears that occur when you are emotionally moved. When performing eye surgery, an ophthalmologist can inject an anesthetic that will stop the production of basal and reflex tears. This allows them to operate on the eye without the annoyance of having all this fluid moving around. But psychic tears can still be generated. This is something you have to be careful about as an ophthalmologist if you're doing surgery. If the person is awake, then you have to be careful. You don't want someone walking into the room and saying, oh, by the way, your pet dog has just died, because psychic tears can be shed even though you've anesthetized all the rest of the lacrimal gland. And the reason for this is that there are two different forms of innervation. Reflex tears and irritant tears arise from cranial nerve, the fifth cranial nerve, whereas psychic tears rely on a branch of the cranial nerve number 7. It's a completely separate nerve. Humans have an additional nerve that's not found in other primates. In fact, it's not found in any other mammal that's been looked at, that causes psychic tears. The distinctive neuroanatomy of psychic tears is consistent with crying as an evolved human behavior. So does weeping involve any purpose-specific anatomy or physiology? You bet. The profusion of tears in human crying depends on a new anatomical change, the appearance of a novel nerve innervating the lacrimal glands. If weeping is an ethological signal, then it should induce a proximal feeling state in observers that leads to actions that benefit both the person weeping and the person responding to the weeping. Well, the benefits to the weeping person are pretty straightforward. The benefits include the receiving of assistance, the suspension of aggression, or simply the inducing of a favorable, that is to say, a warm or pro-social attitude from observers. The benefits for the observer now of the weeping. In most cases, weeping induces pro-social feelings like compassion in observers, feelings that commonly lead to helping, that is to say, altruistic behaviors. Now, altruism is well-trod territory in evolutionary biology. We can distinguish ultimate motivations for altruistic behavior, and we can also from the proximal motivations. With regard to ultimate motivations, pro-social or altruistic behaviors can lead to improved kin selection, reciprocal altruism, where a person incurs a debt and the expectation is the debt will be repaid potentially at some future point. Enhanced social status with respect to the assisted person. So we gain social status when we help someone else out with that person. There's also reputation maintenance when they're observers of our interaction that enhance the altruist's reputation. And the reverse of that is the avoidance of social punishment if you fail to come to the assistance of the person who's weeping. These are the ultimate motivators. The proximal motivators are these feelings that happen. So the feeling of compassion, which leads us to want to intervene, reduced commiseration. So if there's somebody who's in pain or hurting in some way, our assistance will also make us feel better because we're no longer having to commiserate with this stressful state that the person is in. So feelings of social approval when there is a group around, even if there's no group to observe one's behavior, there's the private feeling of virtue. And there's bonding warmth, because the research shows that we bond pretty well to people who weep. We form a bond with them. Okay, so weeping bears all the hallmarks of an ethological signal. But tears, of course, appear in many other situations. We've only been talking about tears associated with grief. Weeping is commonly observed among happy winners of beauty pageants. Weeping is also commonly evoked by feelings of pain. Weeping is frequently observed in situations of religious piety or ecstasy. Of course, people often cry at weddings. Feelings of patriotism can also bring people to tears. And it's not uncommon in situations of extreme humor for people to laugh so hard that it brings them to tears. Famously, female fans of the Beatles wept in the presence of their adored stars. So why all these other situations? Perhaps the most interesting case is that of the weeping beauty pageant winner. Why would someone who is likely experiencing joy or happiness weep? The effect of weeping is best understood if we contrast the weeping to gloating celebration. So suppose that the weeping beauty pageant winner was akin to the triumphant boasting of the boxing champion. So she turns to the other contestants, thrusts her arms into the air, and she declares, "I am the greatest," or "tough luck, suckers." The effect of weeping is to evoke pro-social feelings of compassion in the audience, but the motivation for the weeping is not grief. Instead, the weeping represents a powerful declaration of humility. The aim is to communicate the polar opposite of gloating, namely modesty. So what are the common behaviors evident in observers of weeping? In all of these cases, the weeping tends to evoke a broadly pro-social disposition in the observer. This pro-social attitude may manifest itself in the termination of aggression, compliance to explicit requests or desires of the weeper, the offering of altruistic assistance, even in the absence of overt requests, and generally a feeling of connection or bonding, or simple favorable attitude towards the individual who's weeping. Here's another example from joyous weeping. The photograph here shows the sumo wrestler champion, Tokoshiro, pardon me for mangling the name here, Makato, weeping after winning the 2020 new Grand Slam sumo tournament in Tokyo. Like Western wrestlers and boxers, public weeping is extremely rare in sumo. It's not a behavior one commonly sees for physical champion, especially among males. This is a famous photograph of this is a famous incident in Japan. Entering the competition, Tokoshiro was the lowest ranked of the 18 competitors. Nevertheless, he prevailed over all 18 of them and came out the champion. He certainly did not expect to prevail over all of the others. His weeping might suggest that he's not arrogant, self-obsessed, boastful, or pompous. Curious about people's reactions, I conducted a simple survey where I asked students and colleagues to respond to this photograph. When asked to speculate about Tokoshiro's personality, my Western survey respondents described him as hardworking, conscientious, sensitive, empathetic, kind, and agreeable. They also described him as vulnerable and lacking in self-confidence. When asked whether they responded positively or negatively to Tokoshiro's, with only a couple of exceptions, my respondents all declared a positive or very positive response. Okay, so that although weeping can be induced by multiple motivating emotions like grief, pain, joy, humor, patriotism, adoration, and so on, weeping tends to evoke a much narrower range of responses in observers: compassion, commiseration, bonding warmth, anticipated virtue, anticipated reputation. Indeed, the induced response in the observers amounts to a single stereotypic emotion, compassion. Although this illustration pertains only to weeping, it turns out that this pattern is characteristic of signals in general, including smiling, laughter, aggression, and so on. That is, the range of emotional responses induced in observers of a signal tend to be much more narrowly constrained than the many emotions that might lead someone to generate the signal. We tend to think of displays such as weeping or smiling as reliable indicators of a person's emotional state. However, examination of weeping raises serious doubts about this common presumption. When we encounter someone with tears in their eyes, in the absence of other contextual information, the tears tell us little about what the person is feeling. A reasonable guess might be that the person is experiencing grief, but that conclusion might be entirely wrong. By contrast, we have a better chance of correctly inferring that an observer of weeping is likely to experience a feeling of compassion. As we emphasized later, the emotional state that is most reliably predicted by a signal is that of the observer, not that of the signaler. So we rely heavily on context to infer whether tears are the results of joy or grief or whatever. Returning back to the research showing a big difference between the ability of younger adults and older adults to decipher what a particular emotion is being nominally expressed in sounds or in facial displays. Why are older people so much worse? The answer is they distribute their answers much more broadly because they're aware when they look at something, a face that's weeping, has tears in its eyes, or they hear a choked up voice, they recognize that doesn't always mean grief. In other words, older people are not worse at identifying these recognizing emotions, they're better. And they're better because they've had much more experience with these different facial displays and vocal displays in a much wider range of emotional circumstances. Does a smile indicate happiness or stress? Does laughter reveal playfulness or nervousness? Does weeping denote grief or joy? The problem with these questions is in these words indicate, reveal, and denote. Emotions are not recognized, they're decoded or deciphered. We do not wear our emotions on our sleeves. Emotions are covert, as predicted by theory. The most widely assumed model of emotion is what might be called the emotion revelation model. The idea is that there exist emotional expressions, such as smiling, frowning, weeping, laughing, etc., that reveal or communicate our emotions to others. So, for example, if I feel happy, this then causes me to smile. You see my smile. You associate the smile with feeling happy, and perhaps that also causes you to feel happy as well. Ethology gives us a different perspective on this whole scenario. Some, but not all emotions might evoke an innate signal, such as weeping, laughing, or smiling. And that same signal can be evoked by more than one emotion. The signal tends to be induced to induce a predictable emotion in observers, an emotion that serves as the proximal motivation, encouraging a particular behavior by the observer. And the resulting observer behavior commonly benefits both the signaler and the observer. Let's look briefly at another example. Expressions or the facial display of aggression or threat. If an aggression display is an ethological signal, we'd have to ask the question, what are the benefits to the signaler and to the observer? Okay, well, let's say that this woman is showing this facial display because I've stolen her food. The very fact that she's made this expression suggests, especially if I'm intimidated, if she's socially superior or physically superior, this presages the possibility of her attacking me. And so what I might do is, I think I'll give you your food back. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have stolen that. The value here is that I don't get attacked because it presages the possibility of an attack when she makes this expression. The benefit for the signaler is that an aggression display may be sufficient for the observer to accede to the signaler's demand without the need for physical altercation, which could potentially lead to injury. And for the observer, there are two benefits. First, the observer benefits from having been warned of the possibility of violence, as opposed to the signaler simply attacking without warning. And secondly, the observer benefits from an opportunity to assess the possible result of a fight and to choose either to back away, that is to submit to the situation, if there's a likelihood of injury, or to stand one's ground if there's a likelihood of prevailing over the signaler. So the display actually benefits both individuals. So one further extended example, in this case, smiling. So of course, smiling happens in happy, joyous, or when we're pleased or contented. But we also know from the research that it happens in case of stress, and people smile under discomfort, misery, embarrassment. They're shy or polite smiling, and when we're socially apprehensive. There are lots of situations in which we smile. By way of illustration, consider the following real-world incident captured on a UK reality television show entitled UK Border Patrol. The show documents border encounters with people attempting to smuggle illegal goods or endeavoring to enter the UK as illegal immigrants. It's common in the show for a border officer to become suspicious of someone after detecting some discrepancy that suggests that the person may be lying. When confronting the person with this anomaly, most people attempt to explain away the inconsistency by embellishing a further set of lies. At some point in the show, however, the evidence becomes overwhelming that the person's story is not tenable. When confronted with the contradicting evidence, the person often but not always acknowledges that they've not been truthful. In one episode, a young man from a developing country is presented with clear evidence that he's been lying. At this precise moment, the man's response is a gentle smile, which he maintains while making direct eye contact with the immigration officer. Remember, this is a reality television show, so they captured this in a real world situation. The smile of this individual is not the sort of smile that might suggest, well, I almost got away with it. The smile, instead, the smile and the body language appears to be highly differential. We're going to return to this story a little later. Okay. There's a phylogeny to smiling. It's something we share in common with virtually all primates. In primates, the similar display is typically called either the fear grimace, the fear grin, the silent grin, or more neutrally, the silent bared teeth display. Here you see an example. It's commonly displayed when approached by a dominant animal. So you're a submissive animal, the dominant animal is coming by, and you make this display. And the research shows that making this display reduces the likelihood of an assault by the dominant animal. The key here is that this display is made in all other primates apart from humans when they're afraid. Now, actually, humans also have a version of the smile which is evoked by fear. I like to call it the yikes smile. So there's a snake or something, you kind of, and you can see this kind of smile. It's not very common, but it does occur. As already noted, the human smile is sometimes associated with submissive or non-threatening behavior. Okay. Now, how do we explain the smile? Ethologists talk about size symbolism. So aggression displays throughout the animal kingdom are associated with trying to appear larger. So you see this, for example, when a cat arches its back and makes its hair stand on end, or when a bear looms up on its hind legs and so on. It's attempting to look bigger and consequently more intimidating. And conversely, submission displays are associated with efforts to appear smaller. So a dog will crouch down, submissive dog will crouch down, tuck its tail between its legs, and so on. Now, there's also an auditory version of this sound size symbolism. The work of John Ohala in particular has been really important here. Ohala has a beautiful description of the acoustic origins of the smile. The thing about a smile is that you can hear it. And what happens with a smile when you retract the zygomatic muscles is that you shorten the vocal tract length by pulling the lips taut against the teeth. And Ohala pointed out that the opposite of the smile is not the frown, but the pout. So if I take my lips and I'm drawing them back, I'm shortening the vocal tract length, which raises the frequency. And one of the best generalizations one can make acoustically is that small resonant cavities or small low mass is associated with higher frequency, and large volumes or large mass is associated with lower frequency. So again, can be used as a signal of size. So in the pout, what we do is the opposite of that. So instead of retracting the lips, we push the lips out, and now we extend the length of the vocal tract, and we end up with the Hollywood sound of the cliche hooligan. I'm a bad guy now. So, so you see sound size symbolism also happens. So the smile then is associated with a deference. Now, in the genuine Duchenne smile, the characteristic is also squinting. So you see this, crow's feet around the eyes because of the squinting. Now, this is a common component of a defense posture. So if you're about to be struck or you're about to be assaulted, squinting is part of the natural response that happens there. So the contraction of one set of muscles suggests that we are attempting to appear small, These are the zygomatic muscles that shorten the vocal tract length, and the contraction of another set of muscles, the orbis oculari muscles, that suggest that we're preparing to be attacked. If the proximal motivation for smiling is a response to fear or stress, one might then interpret smiling as a sign of submission or deference. So what does it mean to be deferential? Deference is a willingness to surrender resources to another animal that is relinquishing food to a dominant individual. Now, for humans, we have language, so we can do a whole lot more sophisticated things. Deference is largely doing what you're told, acceding to verbal requests. If smiling is a signal, it must benefit both individuals, the smiler and the observer of the smile. The benefit for the observer is that the smiler signals a willingness to accede to requests. And the benefit for the smiler, although the deferential individual incurs a cost, the act of capitulation or submission reduces the likelihood of violence. So recall that the silent barred teeth display in other primates has the effect of reducing the likelihood of being attacked by a dominant animal. Now, what about happy? We feel happy because that's the other situation in which we're smiling. We feel happy when conditions are good and when all of our needs are satisfied. We're happy when we have ample or plentiful resources, when we're in good health, when our offspring are thriving, when our actions are not constrained, when we're praised, respected, or accorded high social status, where we have good future prospects for any and all of those, the above conditions. In other words, we are happy when indicators point to high biological fitness. They're all associated with fitness. So what does the research tell us about the effects of smiling on observers? 3 common effects. Mutual smiling, where the observer of a smile reciprocates by also smiling. Secondly, approach and affiliation, where observers are more likely to interact with a smiling person. And number 3, favor requests. Observers are more likely to ask a favor of a smiling person. Let's focus particularly on the last of these, number 3, favor requests. Let me tell a story here. A couple of years ago, prior to the pandemic, I had the opportunity to spend some months in Anchorage, Alaska. I found myself frequently going for walks around the nearby downtown district. Like many cities, Anchorage sadly hosts a cohort of homeless people, mostly people suffering from alcoholism or drug addiction. Initially, I found myself walking past homeless people with a sort of stoic trepidation bordering on embarrassment. I didn't want to give money since that would surely end up purchasing the drug of choice, but I found that I felt uncomfortable simply ignoring people. I wanted to somehow acknowledge the existence of the street people rather than simply ignoring them. So one day I resolved that instead of simply ignoring them, I'd make brief eye contact accompanied by a very modest social smile. My intention was simply to express some sort of wordless greeting that would recognize our mutual presence in the world. The effect was absolutely dramatic. On each occasion, everyone who saw my weak smile responded immediately. Without exception, everyone reacted by asking for money. That is, the response of the observers was to make a request. So how do people interpret smiles? Observers around the world regard smiling as symptomatic of trait compliance. Wonderful meta-analysis here by this group in Austria. People who score high on compliance are more responsive to requests. So all around the world, people interpret someone who's smiling as someone who's compliant. Ask them for something. Smiling is an invitation to entertain requests. The best time to ask for a raise is when your boss is smiling. When happy, you purchase the benefits of altruistic acts at the lowest cost. Let me say that again. When you have plentiful resources, the cost of engaging in altruism is extremely low. If you have few resources, then it becomes more expensive. But you benefit from all the altruistic benefits, from all the benefits we know, the proximal benefits and the ultimate benefits that happen from engaging in altruistic acts. So why do we observe smiles in both happy and stressful situations? Well, the stressful situation. Let's go back to the UK Border Patrol episode I mentioned earlier. Remember the man who was then caught out, and now he's probably going to be denied entry into the country. His response is a very modest smile directed directly at the immigration officer. In effect, what he's saying is, I'm in a sticky situation here. What can I do for you that might resolve this situation? In other words, in effect, what he's doing is inviting a request from the immigration officer. What about the happy smile? I'm doing really well here. I can purchase the benefits of altruistic actions at a very low cost to me. Is there anything I can do for you? So back to polygenic signaling. Smiling and weeping are essentially complementary signals. Weeping is an appeal for help, whereas smiling effectively is an offer to help, or more properly, that's a rather informal way of putting it. More formally, weeping is an effort to induce pro-social feelings in observers, and smiling is a pro-social invitation. Both can evolve because the altruistic action typically benefits both individuals. So now we might ask the question, why do signals end up being polygenic in the first place? Let's take a hypothetical case. Let's imagine that there existed a thirst signal. I don't know what it is. Maybe I do this or something like that, and you recognize that as, oh, David's thirsty. Okay. So let's suppose that there exists a thirst signal. So I feel thirsty. Let's call that state W. That's the feeling state. And what it does is it encourages me or induces me to produce the signal, X. So I make the signal, which as an observer then, you recognize the signal and it induces the proximal feeling in the observer here. Let's call the induced proximal feeling Y. And that typically then results in water provisioning. That is a change of behavior, which then provides water for the person who's made the signal. Let's call that Z. Now, suppose I want water for some other purpose. I'm not thirsty. I don't need water because maybe I need it to wash my clothes or wash my hands, or I need it to water my garden or something like that. Now notice issuing the signal X is likely to produce water provisioning behaviors Z without me feeling thirsty. So mature signals ultimately tend to exhibit these polygenic origins. So smiling can ensue in response to many different feelings like joy and stress, and weeping can ensue in response to many different feelings like grief, joy, loyalty, etc. So I think we don't have time to talk about eating here. So let's just simply move on to our conclusion. So let's go back to our 5 classic problems that I mentioned at the beginning. The problem of polygenic displays. Why are emotions-associated displays associated with so many possible motivating emotions? Displays like weeping, smiling, and laughter are induced by many more emotions than simply grief, joy, or amusement. The answer that arises when we take ethology seriously is that the purpose of a signal is to change the behavior of the observer, not to communicate the emotional state of the displayer. That is, the purpose of a signal is manipulation, not revelation. The emotion that is most reliably associated with a signal is the emotion induced in an observer, not the presumed emotion motivating the display. In analyzing emotion-associated displays, emotion researchers have been generally looking at the wrong person. We see somebody smiling, and the researcher asks, and we ask, why are they smiling? What are they feeling that causes them to smile? What we're not paying attention to is, what do I feel? What has the smile done to me? Classic problem number 2, the problem of covert emotions. Why should we apparently communicate fear, grief, or joy, but not communicate feelings like loneliness, hunger, or affection? Most emotions have no associated display. This includes envy, regret, pride, loneliness, jealousy, nostalgia, suspicion, affection, boredom, and compassion. Why do some emotions provoke displays and not others? Once again, from an ethological perspective, information should be actively disseminated only when it is to the advantage of the individual disseminating the information. Emotions are predictive of ensuing behavior, so knowing someone's emotional state helps the observer with only rare benefit to the displayer. Consequently, we would expect most or all emotions to be concealed or covert. Signals such as weeping, smiling, or frowning only seem to communicate emotions. They are not emotional expressions. When recognized as signals, such displays suggest that most or all emotions are indeed covert, as predicted by theory. Accordingly, emotional states are not expressed or disclosed by displayers. Traces of emotional states are inadvertently deposited in the environment. Emotional states are not recognized by spectators. They are decrypted or deciphered by experienced and sensitive observers. Third classic problem, the problem of the absent audience. We didn't get into this in detail, but let me give you a simple example. There's a lovely study that was done by one of the major air carriers that has a lot of flights across the Atlantic Ocean. On these long haul flights, people are watching a lot of movies. And in many cases, these movies might bring a person to tears. And they were concerned about how people were reacting. If you're sitting in a middle seat, then there's a stranger to your right and to your left, and they're watching different movies. And now this movie is bringing tears to your eyes. What they discovered was that the reaction of women in this situation was to pretend that they had something caught in their eye. And the response of men was very interesting. Men tended to take a blanket and put it over their head. In other words, in both cases, there was an effort to mask the response. Why are they masking the response? The reason is because the response is innate. It's very difficult to override. There is cognitive control to some extent over these affective displays, but there, as would be expected with signals, these are innate behaviors. There aren't very many innate behaviors in human behavior, but signals are one of them. If the purpose of an emotional expression is communication, why do emotional displays like crying, smiling, or laughing often happen alone in the absence of an observer? To which the answer is, well, first, let's recast the question in terms of signals. If the purpose of a signal is to change the behavior of an observer, why do signals often arise in the absence of the observer? And the answer is that signals are innate. As innate behaviors, we have difficulty suppressing or inhibiting them. Consequently, signals such as crying, smiling, or laughing may occur whether or not there is an audience present. The common observation that displays can arise in private testifies to their automaticity. Note that in early Homo sapiens environments, there would have been little privacy. Consequently, unlike modern environments where one can often find an empty room, most weeping would have been observed. That is to say, private crying would have been relatively rare in early hominin environments where weeping would have evolved. Classic problem number 4, the problem of poor display recognition. If emotions are supposed to be universal, why are observers so bad at identifying the underlying emotion corresponding to a given emotional display? Recall that the effect size for recognizing the emotions associated with different facial displays is small for non-Western participants, and that older people are significantly, quote, worse than younger people in identifying the emotions coinciding with the different facial or acoustical displays. From a signaling perspective, signals are displays, not emotions. Once again, displays like smiling can arise from many different motivating emotions. And this is what older people recognize. Older people have had more experience seeing these different displays in different circumstances. Without a clear context, observers have trouble deciphering the motivating emotion. Older people are not worse than younger people in identifying the presumed motivating emotion. On the contrary, they are more experienced and so recognize that smiling, laughing, weeping, and other signals arise from many possible emotions. And then our 5th one, we didn't talk about this, I guess. So why are there social versions of, we have the innate disposition to smile. We end up with the Duchenne or genuine smile, but we also have social versions of that. And that's also true for almost all of the other displays. I can feign laughter, as opposed to spontaneous or genuine laughter. I can make the frowning face. I can make these things. People are also very good at being able to distinguish the spontaneous version from the social version of that. And maybe in the discussion afterwards, we could talk about why these might be the case. Let's move on about this. And so finally, the reprise here. And this is my little summary here of what I call the signaling theory of emotion-associated displays STED. So notice that I'm no longer using the phrase facial expression or emotional expression because they're not expressing anything. They're not intended to be to communicate our emotional state. As signals, they're simply intended to transform the behavior of the observer. So I'm referring them as to emotion-related associated displays. So stead here, you can, if you want a mnemonic here to try to remember this, it's instead of the usual way of thinking about emotions, the stead theory, the signaling theory of emotion-associated displays. The only reason for an animal to make a display is that it typically changes the behavior of an observer. If the observer's subsequent behavior is disadvantageous for the displayer, then selection pressure would eliminate the display. Consequently, the only displays that survive are displays that commonly change the behavior of the observer to the benefit of the displayer. If an observer's behavior is to the disadvantage of the observer, then the observer's tendency to behave in a particular way in response to a display would be eliminated by selection pressures. Consequently, the only display response interactions that survive are those that commonly change the behavior of the observer to the benefit of both the displayer and the observer. That is to say, signals evolve in situations of non-zero-sum games. In zero-sum games, you have one of the individuals in the interaction is going to benefit at the disadvantage of the other. It's when you have these converging situations where it's to the benefit of both individuals that these signals arise. An example in the animal kingdom would be lions signaling to each other that it's time to go and do a hunt. A single lion hunting is going to be much less effective than if it can recruit another lion to participate. So you want to have a signal that both recognize, and then they both engage in this activity that's to the benefit of both individuals. That is to say, it's a non-zero-sum situation. Ethologists call these situations, what happens here, signals. That's what they arise and that's what they're for. This means that displays such as smiling, frowning, threat or aggression, fear, weeping, laughter, they commonly result in interactions that benefit both the displayer and the observer. The purpose of a display is not revelation, but manipulation. Now, it should be, unfortunately, the word manipulation has sort of negative connotations, but you should realize that in these signal situations, the manipulation is ultimately to the benefit of both individuals. So we shouldn't think of manipulation here as sort of this negative thing of which we'd associate with a zero-sum game. Displays are often typically motivated by a displayer's emotion. However, many different emotions can lead to the same display. What these situations share in common is the response of the observer. Weeping tends to induce a proximal emotion in observers that commonly leads to acts of assistance, the suspension of aggression, or simply the forming of a favorable pro-social attitude toward the weeping individual. Displays are not very predictive of the emotion of the displayer. Instead, displays are more predictive of the induced emotion of the observer. That is to say, the emotion motivating a display are not recognized, they're deciphered or decoded. It is problematic to call emotion-related displays like smiling or weeping facial expressions or expressions. They are not intended to communicate or express what the displayer feels, so it's preferable to refer to them as emotion-associated displays. In general, emotion researchers have been looking at the wrong person. We should be looking at the behavior induced in the observer rather than focusing specifically on the displayer. And with that, I bring my presentation to an end, and thank you for your attention.
So thank you, David. That was really very interesting and thought-provoking. I'm wondering if people want to ask questions. I'll open it up to the floor. Maybe I'll start it off with a question that I had, which was, I found it really interesting, this dissociation of the tears into, you know, the psychic tears could be dissociated from others. Are there other aspects of human responses that are dissociated in the same way?
There was evidence about a decade ago suggesting that tears may have a pheromone in them. So there was research done by Shani Gelstein and her colleagues in Israel. They induced women to cry by showing them passages from movies with sad scenes, and they had their test tubes at the ready, and they were there collecting up the tears. And then what they did was they had men smell these things. And they had, the control condition was a saline solution, just an inert saline solution. And they found that, and they measured testosterone levels and libido in the men, and they found that the testosterone levels and libido crashed when they were smelling the actual tear. You can't smell the difference, by the way. There's no noticeable difference. Alas, that research has not been replicated. So we don't know whether there's a pheromone in tears that transform. So the impression here would be that this would reduce aggressive dispositions in people who were in close proximity to someone who was shedding tears. But as I said, efforts to replicate that work have failed. Apart from that, I think we need to look to the neuroscience and some of the neurochemistry, and I think that's at a primitive stage yet before we'll be able to figure out what's going on.
Thank you. Is there anybody else who'd like to ask a question? Linda? I think I saw Linda's hand.
I don't have a question. Thinking about all this.
You just, okay. Fernanda?
Hi, I want to thank you for your talk. It was great. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about like the cultural part of the emotional display.
Yeah. So my goodness. So weeping is a very good example, and especially if you start looking at mourning rituals, you see all over the world, anthropologists have documented all sorts of different kinds of mourning rituals. So my goodness, there's so much to say here. So some of the things that happen in mourning can be interpreted through an ethological lens, but of course many of them can't. Many of them are, there's a cultural inertia that happens there. So for example, remember that one of the characteristics of a signal is conspicuousness. You need to draw attention to these. So around the world, you do see in mourning rituals efforts that or behaviors that look consistent with increasing conspicuousness. So in many cultures, people will do things like if you're in mourning, they'll shave their head, so they'll get rid of hair, or they'll smear ash or charcoal on their face. They'll dress in black clothing or some other things. So there are many situations in which you could say, from an ethological perspective, it looks like ways of increasing the conspicuousness. Also, to the extent that a signal is inviting responses from observers, there's always the potential for deception. And so usually what happens when you're trying to prevent deception is to make it more costly for the signaler. So if I incur a very obvious cost, it's more likely to impress you that I'm being genuine. So what you also see frequently in mourning rituals around the world is forms of self-injury. So you'll see amongst the Falalan in Egypt, for example, women used to slap their faces to the point where they would draw blood. Or there are many instances in which people will cut themselves in mourning. These are obviously things that are very costly for the individual and can be interpreted from an ethological perspective as increasing the honesty of the signal and making it obvious that the person is in need. There are other situations. There's a wonderful thing called the welcome of tears. So in Brazil, there are reports already from the 16th century when the first Europeans were setting there of they'd go into the interior of Brazil, along part of the coast, sort of not quite into the Amazon, but the sub-Amazon region. There are a whole group of tribes there, like the Tupinamba Indians and so on, which do something called the Welcome of Tears. And today you can still see it. People still do this. So what impressed Europeans was that they might be traveling through the forest and they would encounter some Tupinamba Indians, for example. And the response of the Indians was to start to cry. And so they would go, they would do this. And what impressed the Europeans was how fake it was. Because it was clearly fake. And they would just go, and then they'd abruptly turn it off. All right. Okay, so from an ethological perspective, you can say, what on earth is going on here? So one interpretation of this, imagine you're in a situation in which there's there's no police. Encountering people in the forest is potentially very dangerous. You might be raped or stolen from or murdered or enslaved. There are all sorts of bad things that can happen when you meet strangers in the forest. So what we know from research that's been done is that in these tenseful situations, the normal, one thing you could do is to show how you could pull out your weapons and show, I'm really powerful here, don't mess with me. But what we find cross-culturally is that mostly there are efforts to bring down the stress. And for example, it's thought that showing an open hand is a way of showing that I'm not carrying a weapon and so forth. And so what's the most deferential thing that you could do? You could weep, okay? And the weeping here is just, it's inviting this pro-social behavior here. But notice that it's fake. It's a social version of that. And so now if they actually wept, the people who are encountering you might think, oh, these people, they don't, they're a pushover. Hey, I think I'll take all their food from them. I think, let's enslave them. But no, the very fact that it's fake, and it's obviously fake, is kind of saying, we'd like to be submissive here, but don't think that we're powerless. We're not powerless here. We're doing the crying thing here to try to reduce the thing and incite this kind of pro-social situation. But the very fact that it's obviously fake, it's like the social smile, as opposed to the genuine smile. It says, I'm ready to help you out here, but don't take advantage of me. I'm in control here, as opposed to the genuine smile. Now, those are examples where we can interpret these things from an ethological perspective, but there are many other, culture has its own inertia and its own history, and you can have many behaviors and many rituals that, there's no sort of naturalistic interpretation of them. They're part of what the culture has established. So I've given you a biased account of some things we can interpret ethologically, but there are many other situations that's not the case. And incidentally, since my main area is music, this is especially important in the case of music when we start looking at the cultural context in which expressions that start looking like they're bootstrapping a signal, but they're clearly a form of artifice. I'm sorry, I went off way too long on that question. It gets me excited when we start talking about the cultural stuff. And I feel embarrassed that there was nothing in the talk about that. I would have gone on and on, I'm afraid.
Linda?
Yeah, I guess kind of looking at this, maybe the opposite of this is, what about like really early in development before culture has kind of kicked in and you have infants? Is the situation different in terms of how emotion is working, and why wouldn't an infant want to convey exactly what they're feeling? Why would they not want to express that?
Thank you for asking that question. So in the crying research, there's a problem that many people who've been involved in this research haven't made a distinction between two forms of crying. So adult crying and infant crying are very different. So adult crying, it bears a very close resemblance to laughter. So what they share in common is vocalized punctuated exhaling. So all I have to do is smile or frown, and I can change laughter into crying. So, and this requires quite sophisticated pulmonary activity. That's not how infants cry. Infants bawl. And so bawling is a very different thing. Bawling involves vocalization. There's no punctuated exhaling. And the wail here is a full exhale of, an infant's crying, wah, wah, wah. So there's a full exhale on each of these cases. Now, what's really interesting is that bawling over a period of, it dominates the first year of life. It's not till towards the end of the first year of life that you start seeing adult form of weeping occurring. And that becomes greater as you go. Now, they're two completely different signals. Bawling, it turns out, there's this wonderful work that was done, I can't think of her name now, at the University of Winnipeg, did a lovely study where she recorded all these infant cries from different animals, including humans, and they were all recorded in the first week of life. And it turns out that human bawling, infant bawling, resembles very strongly separation distress calls. So she did this lovely experiment where they had a loudspeaker out in the field with these deer. And what they did was they played these sounds from all sorts of different kinds of animals of separation distress calls. And now deer just basically ignore these sounds, except if they're female deer who've been mothers. And you play these sounds, you play human bawling to them, and they come up to the loudspeaker. Okay. Isn't that cool? And okay, so now bawling is maximum in the absence of the caregiver. In the presence of the caregiver, it's reduced. Weeping is maximum in the presence of the caregiver and not present in the absence of the caregiver. That is to say, bawling has a different purpose. It's to bring the caregiver to help. And also we know is that it also encourages the letdown response. So it has a marked impact on mothering. So they're two different signals. They have completely different purposes, and they're also different sounds that happen. So,
and my understanding from what I know about infant cry is that, which I learned from a person who's done work on cultural differences that you can hear, like linguistic differences you can hear in crying. And she makes a distinction between what she calls mitigated crying and kind of like distress crying. So when babies are vocalizing and kind of, we call it crying because we don't know what else to call it, but it's not because they're distressed, it's something else that they're doing. Yeah. And it's those signals where they see, you can see some impact of language. So a baby from China might sound different than a baby from Germany, for example.
I think one of the chapters that I'm very proud of in the book is the one on temper tantrums. So I won't go into detail here, but there's a lot of interesting things to say about temper tantrums. Anyway, I'm sorry. Yeah, but you're right. All of these things are mitigated. Language has a huge impact, especially when the child is. You have to ask the question: why do we have to have these signals in the first place when all you need is language? So this is a problem, for example, with deaf parents. So for many deaf parents, what they do is they have a detector that they'll put in the crib of the infant that detects the fact that they're crying. And then for the deaf parents, they'll have a light in their bedroom if they're sleeping in a separate bedroom that'll start flashing and so on. But the research shows that deaf parents are not as reactive to the bawling of an infant as hearing parents are to the sound, which harkens back to the innateness problem. The problem is a flashing light doesn't have the same gut thing of the sound of a bawling infant. So it's another one of these things where even the learning of this isn't to cast aspersions on deaf parents, but they aren't as reactive, largely because you can't get a light, you can't get an alternative to the bawling sound that's going to push our buttons as deeply.
Thank you.
Matthias?
Yes, well, first of all, I would like to thank you very much for this presentation. It was very, very interesting to put into words, those very interesting concepts. I would like to ask more of a personal opinion from you today. So in light of what you said, would you believe that there would be room for completely selfless acts of cooperation, such as, sharing or willingness to concede resources? Because from what you said, and I think I agree with this, even though it brings me great sadness, that because of its survival and evolutionary roots, acts of compassion or even smiles would be done in a way of manipulating the environment in our benefit, in a instrumental fashion, or even by self-regulating internal pressures such as shame or self-esteem. It's kind of like the example you gave in the beginning of your presentation with the homeless person. If I give money to a homeless person, perhaps it would be to help this individual, or perhaps it would help me and my self-esteem to make myself feel better about my day. So in this context and this very complex dynamic, would you believe today there would be a way for completely selfless acts of compassion?
Sure. So, so these biological ways of interpreting things, for most of us, it looks immoral because our way of understanding the ultimate causation here does not conform to our moral standards of what we think good behavior is. The thing to understand, so these sorts of things are not, these biological interpretations are generally not well received by the general public, and for good reasons. It doesn't conform to the kind of experience that we have in our lives. So when I weep, it doesn't feel like I'm trying to commandeer resources from hapless bystanders. When I weep, I feel it's a genuine sorrow for an unhappy condition in the world. When I help somebody, it's not because I think, oh, goody, this person's going to incur a great debt to me and all my friends are going to think what a great person I am. No, when we engage in helping behaviors, it's because we feel this genuine sense of compassion for a person who's in a stressful situation and need to help. This is why it's so important to understand the distinction between ultimate motivations and proximal motivations. We cognitively, thoughtfully, do not live in the world of ultimate motivations. We live purely in our subjective phenomenological experiences in the proximal world of these emotions. So when we think about these ultimate things, they're largely unhappy situations that we don't want to think about even. You look at St. Augustine, for example, in the writings of St. Augustine, thought that giving alms, giving charitable acts and so on, was a form of self-gratification, and thought this was, you see this in the Bible, for example, in Matthew, where they talk about when you're giving something, there's that wonderful passage about don't let the left hand know what the right hand is doing. In other words, when we're trying to be helpful, we shouldn't be reflecting on what a good person I am or how, and so forth. I think it's important to understand that these are two different worlds that we're talking about, but we should also understand that the proximal world that we live in is actually bootstrapped by these ultimate motivations. That is to say, biology is not irrelevant. Biology is informing and generating these emotional states. Having said that, there's something else that we need to add, and that is compared with other animals, we have these enormous frontal cortex, which is mostly involved in inhibiting behavior. A chimpanzee sees something and it just goes out and grabs it. I want that. There are all sorts of, we walk into a shopping plaza, and there are all sorts of things that we'd be just happy to stick in our pockets and walk away with. But we have these frontal cortices that are mostly involved in inhibiting these these sort of selfish things that would normally occur. And so unlike other animals, we have much, much greater cognitive control or executive control over our actions. So we're not all after power and so forth. Yeah, after prestige and power might encourage people to aim for high social status, like becoming, president of a university or something like that. But there are plenty of people who aim for low social status, or who, there are plenty of hermits and nuns and monks in the world who, voluntarily, want to live a very different life. That's not to say they aren't motivated by esteem, even if it ultimately is just self-esteem. But humans have much, much greater capacity. By the way, I have this, I'm sorry, I'm going off at length here, but I think it's an important issue. An initialism, ami, a friend, AIME. So this is an acronym for the 4 different ways that cognitively we transform emotions. A is amplification, where we take a signal and we amplify it in some way. I is for inhibition. So we can often, if I'm about to cry, I might start thinking, and I don't want to cry in public, I can start thinking about, well, maybe I need to fuel up the car, get some gas, or I start thinking what I'm going to make for dinner or something like that, as a way of trying to inhibit it. Then there's masking. I remember a situation in a class where I was just about to start a lecture, And one of my students came up to me and told me something that I found deeply moving. It was going to bring immediate tears to my, I immediately choked up and I thought, I can't start my lecture or my voice is going to crack. And so what I did was I took my knapsack, which I happened to have there, and I stuck my head in it. And I rooted around as though I was looking for something. And it took a little while, but I finally regained my composure and then I put it down. So that's a masking behavior. And then finally there's emulation. So as in the case of the welcome of tears or the social smile or something, we can often emulate these things. So between amplification, inhibition, masking, and emulation, there's a huge amount of cognitive control that we have that we try to impose on these emotional states. And, so it is indeed possible for people to behave in ways that are truly not self-serving, that are all truly altruistic. I'm sorry, I went off at a length, but I think that's executive control. I think is a really important issue.
I would even like it to go even longer. So thank you so much.
We'll take one last question, and then perhaps David, we'll have another opportunity to bring you back to extend these conversations that people are interested in. So Song Hui.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, David.
Oh, hi, Song. Good to see you.
Yeah, and thank you for your fascinating and very educational talk. So your last mention of AMI model.
Not spelled correctly, I know.
Yeah, well, that is related to what I wanted to ask you about. So, you are distinguishing signals and cues. But for example, something really good happens to me and I don't really want to talk about it, right? So imagine that I won $1 million jackpot, which is going to be really difficult because I don't do the lottery, but imagine that happened. Yeah. But I haven't figured out how to break the news or how I'm going to spend money so I'm just going to keep it cool. So it's my intention not to reveal. But if I go to work, everybody's going to ask me like, why are you smiling today? Right? So in that case, my smile is going to be more like a cue despite my effort to hide it, right? So what do you think about how to distinguish for example, smiles in cues versus signals? And do you think it could be scientifically quantified by in any means?
Oh gosh. Well, I have no doubt that these things can't be quantified. Whether the quantification actually gets at the nub of what the real issue is another matter. But people can try these things, and of course, I applaud any effort to try to understand these things. I think it's a complicated situation because in the same way that we can inhibit and amplify and emulate signals, we can also do the same thing with cues. So let me give you what are examples of human cues? Examples of human cues would be things like somebody walking or snoring or belching or coughing and so on. Cues are to the benefit of an observer, but not to the benefit of the signaler. So if I cough, for example, that at least makes you aware of my presence, right? And in fact, that can be useful. So for example, if my lecture has gone on way too long, or let's imagine a situation where you want to raise a question and we're there live, and you've got your hand up and I'm ignoring it. You can purposely make use of a cue, so you can clear your throat, and now that's a cue, but you're emulating the cue for the purpose of actually drawing my attention, right? Which normally so in other words, we can recruit cues. The same thing happens with belching. So in the case of traditional Indian and Chinese culture, for example, belching post-meal was a way of indicating satiation, and it was a good thing. And now there are people, especially, young boys who are happily able to belch at will, and will happily do that. But being able to belch at will, at least if I in that cultural situation, if I can't belch, or, if I can figure out how to belch, then I might willfully do that. But what am I saying? It's a complicated situation in which you can have, you think of it as a four quadrant here. You have signals and cues, and you have social versions of all of them, and you have spontaneous versions of all of them. And so in the same way that we can recruit something like a smile socially, we can recruit something like belching or clearing your throat socially to achieve particular kinds of ends. Gosh, I think I went off on a tangent here that really didn't address it. I guess what your question does is raise a whole bunch of issues about how signals and cues are used arise in spontaneous situations and are also then used socially and culturally. And that's all over the map. That's a whole big research project of figuring out how all of those things work.
Thank you.
But by the way, we have the same problem identifying our own emotions. So, so in the same way that we have trouble trying to decipher when we see somebody smiling or we see something going on, trying to decipher what state they're in, we basically have the same problem with ourselves. So if I feel hot, for example, if I'm hot, maybe I'm a bit sweaty, how do I interpret the fact that I feel hot? Maybe I'm in a state of fear that's causing me to sweat, or maybe I'm suffering a hot flash if I'm female, or maybe it's just that the temperature is warm. These feeling states don't come with labels attached to them. The labels come from culture, and so we have the same problem. In a sense, we are observers of our own bodily states and our own context, trying to make sense of why we might be feeling a particular way. And the story we tell about that is going to have a potentially dramatic impact on how we feel about how we feel, if that makes any sense, our feelings about our feelings. Let me give you one historical example. In the 17th century in England, there were two rather opposing views of sadness. So amongst the medical profession, sadness was considered bad. It was not good for your health. They were sort of aware, I guess, of what we now call depression and so forth. And melancholy, which comes from the Latin for black bile, they thought it was an excess of black bile and it was just not a good state to be in. So in that century, if you came in with a kind of sadness, the medical profession thought it was a really bad idea. Now, their compatriots who were theologians thought that weeping was fantastic. And so the best thing that could happen in a religious conversion was for the person to weep. And it was interpreted as an awareness of the sinfulness of the world. And so people who wept a lot and who were saddened within theological circles in Britain in the 17th century, it was considered an indication of God's grace. So people who we now would think of as depressed were thought by the theologians as very likely going to heaven. Okay, so you had these two diametrically opposed stories about the meaning of sadness. And so again, these feeling states do not come with labels attached to them. It's through our experience and through our culture that we learn to start putting labels to them and interpretations as to whether they're good or bad states to be in.
Thank you. It's a lot more complex than I expected.
That's all in the book, by the way.
I'm so looking forward to it. Thanks, David.
So thank you very much. It was really great. Do you want to advertise the book now? It's not coming out yet, or
it probably won't be out before Christmas. So
okay. Well,
it is called The Science of Sadness. The subtitle is called A New Understanding of Emotion. So it's really two books. It's a book about sadness, and it's also a book about the Stead theory, which I've just presented here, about how to interpret displays differently.
Well, I think you've provided a lot of food for thought, and I think definitely sounds like there are threads of interest here that could be picked up in future conversations. So perhaps you might be able to come to Montreal and we can have a little lunch at some point.
That would be nice, yes.
People who have registered for this or others could join and discuss with you. So thank you very much for that. That's really wonderful. And thank you everybody for your questions and your time.
Thank you so much, everyone, for showing up. Thank you for your great questions, and I hope to interact again soon. Thank you, Denise, too.
Thank you.